I'm back. Mr. Clarke's back. Time to take a look at John F. Kennedy's foreign policy during the Cold War. We're looking at how John F. Kennedy took steps to improve American foreign policy and change and evolve it throughout the Cold War. Look at his attempts to deal with the ongoing problem of Fidel Castro, the communist leader of Cuba, who took over in 1959, just shortly before John F. Kennedy became president. And we'll assess the outcome of the Berlin crisis and other foreign policy events of the 1960s. Keep in mind that John F. Kennedy is going to have a short time to impact American foreign policy. As we know, he's tragically assassinated, but he did, for a very short period of time, despite his short time, 1,000 days or so as president, he did have quite a big impact on American foreign policy. Question one, why was John F. Kennedy critical of Dwight Eisenhower's foreign policy? How was Kennedy's foreign policy a reaction to the Dwight Eisenhower presidency from 1953 to 1961? During the Eisenhower years, a missile gap developed between the United States and Russia. The communist regime led by Fidel Castro came to power in Cuba. Dwight Eisenhower thought the United States should be cautious in foreign affairs, where John F. Kennedy pledged to close the missile gap and was willing to take action to oppose communism in places like Cuba. So when you think about John F. Kennedy, much more proactive, where Eisenhower was kind of take a step back for America in regard to our leadership around the world. This is kind of surprising since Eisenhower obviously had such a big impact during World War II, and in general, you would think he would have been a little more aggressive than even Kennedy as president. Two, how did John F. Kennedy outline his foreign policy goals during his inaugural address? Well, John F. Kennedy had one of the more, remembered inaugural addresses in American history. John F. Kennedy said the United States would bear any burden to assure the survival of liberty. He committed the United States to helping those countries and being more proactive in foreign affairs to kind of help other countries around the world to have the opportunity to have the same freedoms and democracy that we have here in our own country. John F. Kennedy established what is remembered as the flexible response defense policy. Kennedy did not believe there was one means or one method of responding to a crisis. So if you remember, Dwight Eisenhower's foreign policy included a better bang for the buck, meaning he just wanted to have nukes as a way to deter other countries and use them if need be to go to war. He believed that was the best investment of American dollars. Where John F. Kennedy wanted to have multiple options in order to respond to a crisis around the world. And you can probably objectively look at that as a better idea. You want more options. You don't want to have to go to war. You want to have ways to kind of handle situations that might avoid a nuclear war. So Kennedy did believe we should be prepared to fight a nuclear war if necessary. However, he wanted many, many other options to respond to potentially diverse conflicts around the world. As we continue to look at number three, this plan increased the size of conventional forces with the emphasis on building up the special forces like the Green Beret, the Army Rangers, the Navy SEALs. Flexible response made the United States a more mobile force and made a nuclear war as an option less likely. Question number four, what are third world nations? Why were they a Cold War concern for the United States? Third world nations are developing nations in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were competing to gain the support of these countries. As they develop, they may embrace a new form of government, and the United States wanted to see them form a democratic government, some form of a democracy or republic. The United States was concerned that if the developing countries were struggling, they would look to either the United States or the Soviet Union, and there was no guarantee they would not go to the Soviet Union for help and support, and perhaps develop their own communist government as well. Five, explain the Alliance for Progress. This program pledged $20 billion in assistance to 22 Latin American countries to help lift up their per capita income. John F. Kennedy hoped to improve agriculture, industry, healthcare, and welfare in these countries. And he also felt that if he did this This could help foster a cooperative relationship with Latin America. 6. Why did Kennedy initiate programs such as the Peace Corps and Alliance for Progress that reached out to third world nations? Well, logically, as we had mentioned earlier, we're trying to build relationships with countries around the world. This could build positive relationships in third world countries, in Latin America in particular, because that's in our sphere of influence, kind of our hemisphere here. And of course, Africa and Asia are of importance as well. John F. Kennedy wanted to increase their economic prosperity as he had a broad goal of seeing all citizens around the world, get lifted up out of poverty. He also believed that if these developing nations became prosperous and self-sufficient, they'd be less likely to fall to communism. And as the global economy is expanding, if we foster these good relationships with these countries, then therefore they might want to trade with us, and that can actually help us economically down the road. So a lot of different ideas in regard to getting involved around the globe. 7. How did Fidel Castro come to power in Cuba? When? What type of government did he have? He staged a coup d'etat, or a coup, overthrowing the longtime American-backed dictator of Cuba, Fulgencio Batista, in 1959. Fidel Castro nationalized agriculture industry, established a totalitarian communist government, and he's a leader of Cuba for several decades, so from 1959 right into contemporary times. Shortly after, the United States imposed a ban on American trade and travel to Cuba, and as a result, we really did not have a working relationship with Cuba at all from 1959 right through the Obama administration. 8. Why did the United States plan the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba? And this is John F. Kennedy's kind of leftover plan from the Eisenhower administration that he kind of implemented. The Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, the United States planned an invasion of Cuba to overthrow Castro to stop the spread of communism during the Eisenhower administration in 1960. And when Kennedy came into the presidency, sworn in January of 1961, the CIA and the Defense Department leadership began to really pressure John F. Kennedy. The pressure was on Kennedy to follow through on the plan. They were training Cuban rebels in Guatemala, in Central America. This is a plan to arm these Cuban rebels with American military support behind them. They would then invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. So John F. Kennedy, against his better judgment, was pressured by the CIA to execute and carry out the plan. The invasion was a miserable failure. And the result was that Castro became stronger, and many Cuban Americans disliked Kennedy for implementing the plan. Okay, if you look at the Bay of Pigs, the invasion took place here. And then you can see that the rebels traveled across the Caribbean Sea to Cuba. And we did not follow up with the military support, from air support in particular. And as a result, the rebels were basically just immediately captured or killed. So when you look at number 9, the reason why it was a failure, Kennedy misjudged how most Cubans felt about the United States and supported a rebel group that wasn't as strong as he had hoped. What the United States misinterpreted is they thought that as soon as the American-backed rebels reached the shores of Cuba, the Cuban citizens would come to the streets and kind of rise up collectively in a revolution against Castro. But Castro was in power for such a short period of time. By this period of time, about 2 years, and things weren't that bad. Obviously, as we move forward in history, things really turned kind of poor for the Cuban people. But at this point in time, it wasn't so oppressive yet. It takes time for oppression to kind of fully set in. Cubans resented interference in their affairs as well, and the involvement of the CIA. Finally, the CIA managed the invasion poorly and made many tactical and strategic errors, but not providing the American air support that I alluded to previously. This is not going to end American issues with Cuba, however, as we're going to see. Keep in mind, one of the key reasons why Cuba is of such strategic importance for the United States, 90 miles off the shore of the southern tip of Florida, obviously not too far from much of the southern United States. And so if the Soviet Union and Cuba could formulate a relationship there, this would obviously be a situation where the United States would be in a lot of trouble in regard to the potential threats of the Soviet Union. Ken, what did the United States Intelligence Agency discover in August of 1962 in Cuba? The Soviet Union was installing nuclear missile sites in Cuba. Castro apparently wanted protection from another potential American-supported coup attempt. So what we had to do back during this period of time is we actually had planes, U-2 spy planes that would fly over Cuba, and they would take actual photographs that they would then bring back to the United States, and then they would use like a microscope or magnifying glass to kind of look at the photographs to kind of figure out what was going on there. And you can see the labeled spots here from the photograph. It's an actual photograph. So they have heavy equipment, missile transporters, probable guided missiles, 5 missile dollies, 20 long cylinder tanks, the missile transporters, everything necessary to assemble, arm, and attack the United States with a nuclear missile. And the biggest fear we would have as we kind of look at the map next here. Why were the Soviet installation of nuclear missiles in Cuba so dangerous? Major Eastern American cities, as well as the Panama Canal, would have been within striking distance of Soviet missiles in Cuba. This dangerous threat led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which will last 13 days in October 1962. So look at the range there in a moment. So these are medium-range missiles. Obviously, if they have longer-range ones, they could hit further targets, but medium-range are inexpensive, relationship to the long-range or intercontinental ballistic missiles. And this would give them many different target strikes. The other issue, too, is if you're launching from Cuba, you're not going to have but only a few minutes notice in terms of when the missile is incoming. You can't evacuate cities, and then basically people will be almost instantaneously incinerated. So this was a very problematic situation. John F. Kennedy made a big speech on October 22nd, 1962, and you can see the photograph in the bottom left there. That's Kennedy on a TV, and people all across that particular electronics shop watching the speech. The JFK accused Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who is pictured to the far right. If you look at the 3 parties involved, Khrushchev to the far right, center is Castro, left photographed is Kennedy. JFK stated the United States would create a naval blockade to prevent Soviet supply ships from reaching Cuba. So blockade is actually an act of war. So if you look at the blockade there, and they have it on the map, so basically we would not allow the Soviet ships to reach with the nuclear materials to arm those missiles. And it was kind of a standoff. When the two ships began, the two sides of the ships, the naval ship from the Soviets and the United States fired upon each other, World War III would have broke out. So this is one of the most dangerous periods of time. As we move forward this year, looking at the Cold War, this is going to be the most dangerous period of time in the history of the Cold War, the closest we probably came to an all-out World War III. Eventually, a back-channel deal was negotiated behind the scenes as we look at number 13. Soviet Union and the United States negotiated behind the scenes to avoid war. John F. Kennedy promised, and this would be 6 months later, to remove our missiles that were put in Turkey if Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba. This agreement avoided war, and World War III was very narrowly avoided. So you can basically see the two sides, Khrushchev and Kennedy, basically arm wrestling. You see each having their finger near the button, which would fire a nuclear missile at each other. We also developed the hydrogen bombs, so I have the H bombs there that we could have used as well. The United States Secretary of State Dean Russ said, and he was quoted as saying, "We went eyeball to eyeball, and they blinked first," meaning the Soviet Union. They could have continued to push their nuclear missiles into Cuba, and that could have went to World War III. Russ meant that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, either Khrushchev or Kennedy would lose face and possibly lose power if they backed down. Khrushchev ultimately gave in to American demands because he had the advantage temporarily because he had the missiles going in there, but he did not bring in the armaments for them, and he did ultimately remove them, thankfully for the United States, the Soviet Union, and the world. 15, how did the results of the Cuban Missile Crisis impact the Cold War? Both countries began working a little bit more towards détente, which is a fancy word for meaning lessening of tensions. They installed the hotline. That's kind of like a red phone that sits in the Oval Office, where you had like a direct line of communication between Moscow and Washington, D.C., in hopes that the two nations, if necessary, could directly communicate and avoid a potential world war. 17, how did the nuclear test ban treaty impact the Cold War and arms race? It banned above ground testing of nukes, which decreased the pressure to outdo each other because now you couldn't even see what each other was really doing. So it kind of lessened a little bit of the competition. In addition, the two superpowers and 36 other nations agreed and signed this treaty. The next crisis is going to take place in regard to Berlin. Berlin's, you can see there the wall being having been constructed there. Berlin, obviously, if you recall our previous discussions, Berlin is the longtime capital city of Germany. However, during the period of time after World War II and during the Cold War, Germany was divided between East Germany, which was communist, and West Germany, which was democratic. But Berlin, the city itself, was completely contained inside of East Germany. So what ultimately they did, in addition to splitting the country in half, they split Berlin in half. And the eastern half of Berlin was communist, the western half of Berlin was democratic. So Khrushchev was really getting irritated and also agitated because the East Berliners were moving into West Berlin to get out of the communist side and into the democratic side. And for Khrushchev, this was an embarrassment. He was outraged at the constant flow of East Berliners into West Berlin. This is an insult to the Soviet Union and communism in general. So in 1962, he built the Berlin Wall, not he physically, but the Soviet Union did. The Berlin Wall then became the chief symbol of the Cold War, and ultimately it would stand for the next 37 years. Lesson reflection question, list the strengths and weaknesses of Kennedy's foreign policy. He's a bit inexperienced, made some initial mistakes, especially with the Bay of Pigs. His flexible response was a key component of his foreign policy, not only for himself, but also future presidents, gave them more diverse options to deal with foreign policy issues. The Peace Corps was successful as a goodwill program, still around, 50 plus years later. And its calm approach to negotiate out of the Cuban Missile Crisis ultimately avoided World War III, and perhaps was his, best decision from a foreign policy standpoint, negotiating and preventing World War III. So until next time, Mr. Clarke is out.